The small diner sat on the edge of a sleepy town, surrounded by miles of open road and endless fields. It wasn't much to look at, just a modest building with faded red paint and a flickering neon sign that read "Open" in wobbly letters. But inside it was warm, cozy, and smelled like freshly brewed coffee mixed with sizzling bacon. For years, this little spot had been a lifeline for truckers passing through, offering hot meals, friendly smiles, and a place to rest their weary bones. On this particular evening, the owner was closing up shop after another long day. He flipped the open sign to closed, wiped down the counter one last time, and started stacking chairs onto tables. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rustling the dry leaves scattered across the parking lot. A few snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, melting as soon as they hit the pavement. Winter was creeping in, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just as he turned off the lights, headlights appeared in the distance. They grew brighter and brighter until a big rig rolled into the nearly empty lot. Then another followed, and another. Within minutes, 10 massive trucks were parked haphazardly outside, their engines rumbling softly in the chilly air. The driver's doors swung open, and one by one men climbed out, stomping their boots to shake off the cold. At first glance, they looked like any other group of truckers. Worn jackets, scruffy beards, caps pulled low over tired eyes. But there was something different about them tonight. Their faces were tight with worry, and their movements carried an urgency that didn't match the quietness of the evening. One of them pushed open the diner door, letting in a gust of icy wind. "Hey, are you still serving?" the man asked, his voice rough but polite. The owner hesitated for a moment. Technically, he was closed. His shift was over, and he'd already cleaned up for the night. But something in the way the man spoke, a mix of exhaustion and desperation, made him pause. He glanced past the first guy and saw the others standing behind him, shivering slightly despite their heavy coats. "Come on in," he said finally, stepping aside to let them enter. "It's freezing out there." As the truckers filed in, stomping their boots on the mat and shaking snow off their shoulders, the owner couldn't help but notice how quiet they were. Usually, groups like this would crack jokes or share stories, filling the room with laughter and chatter. Tonight, though, they barely spoke above a whisper. Something was weighing heavily on their minds. Once everyone was settled, the owner poured cups of coffee and slid plates of leftover pie across the counter. "What brings you all here tonight?" he asked casually, trying to break the tension. One of the men sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "We got caught in this storm," he explained, gesturing toward the window. Sure enough, the gentle flurry from earlier had turned into a full-blown blizzard. Snow swirled violently in the headlights of the parked trucks, and the wind howled like a wild animal. Visibility was almost non-existent, and the roads looked slick and dangerous. "We tried to keep going, but it's just not safe," another man chimed in. "Can't see 2 feet in front of us, and the ice is brutal. Figured we'd stop here till things calm down." The owner nodded slowly, taking it all in. He knew these highways better than most people. They could be treacherous, even on clear days. In weather like this, driving was practically suicidal. These guys weren't just looking for food. They needed somewhere safe to wait out the storm. He glanced around the diner, considering his options. There weren't many places nearby where they could stay. The closest motel was miles away, and no one in their right mind would attempt that drive in these conditions. Besides, this diner had always been more than just a business to him. It was a place where people came together, where strangers became friends over a plate of pancakes and a cup of joe. "Well," he said with a small smile, "looks like you're stuck with me for the night." The relief on their faces was immediate. Some smiled weakly, others muttered thanks under their breath, but all of them seemed to relax just a little. The owner grabbed a pot of coffee and started refilling mugs, determined to make sure everyone felt welcome. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the diner, the atmosphere began to shift. Slowly, conversations started up again. Stories were shared, laughter returned, and the weight of the world seemed to lift, if only for a little while. And as the owner moved between tables, pouring drinks and handing out slices of pie, he realized something important. Sometimes, Kindness isn't about grand gestures or heroic acts. Sometimes it's simply about opening your door and your heart to those who need it most. The storm outside grew fiercer with each passing minute. What had started as a gentle snowfall was now a full-blown blizzard, tearing through the night with an intensity that made the diner's windows rattle like they might shatter at any moment. The wind howled so loudly it drowned out the hum of the old neon sign outside, and the darkness beyond the glass seemed alive, swirling with chaos. Every once in a while, the headlights from the parked trucks cut through the storm, casting eerie shadows on the walls inside the diner. Inside, though, things were quieter, warmer. The group of truckers sat huddled around tables, sipping hot coffee and nibbling on whatever food the owner had managed to scrounge up. There wasn't much left after a long day of serving customers, but he'd done his best. A few slices of pie, some reheated soup, and a tray of sandwiches hastily thrown together. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. More importantly, it was given with care, and that made all the difference. One of the men leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together to warm them. "Man, I've seen my share of bad weather," he said, shaking his head. "But this is something else." Another guy nodded in agreement, staring out the window at the relentless storm. "Yeah, no kidding. We're lucky we spotted this place when we did. Another mile or two and we'd have been stuck out there for sure." The owner stood by the counter, listening to their conversation while keeping an eye on the coffee pot. He didn't say much, just moved quietly between tables, refilling mugs and making sure everyone had what they needed. But he was paying attention. Really paying attention. These weren't just random people who'd wandered into his diner. They were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Each one carried stories, struggles, hopes, and fears. And tonight, they were, depending on him. A younger man sitting near the door spoke up, his voice tinged with frustration. "I don't get it. The forecast said light snow, maybe a little ice. Not this." He gestured toward the window, where the snow was piling up faster than anyone could keep track. An older man sitting across from him chuckled dryly. "Forecasts are guesses, kid. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not. Out here, you learn to expect the unexpected." The younger man sighed and took another sip of his coffee. "Still, this is insane. My route's already behind schedule, and now this mess, boss isn't gonna be happy." The older man raised an eyebrow. "Boss will understand if you tell him you were smart enough to pull over instead of risking your neck. Trust me, nobody wins awards for driving through a blizzard." The comment drew a few chuckles from the others, easing some of the tension in the room. But beneath the laughter, there was still a sense of unease. They were stranded, miles from anywhere, with no way of knowing when the storm would let up. Even if it did clear soon, the roads would likely be impassable for hours. As the minutes ticked by, the temperature outside continued to drop. The cold seeped into the cracks around the diner's doors and windows, fighting against the warmth inside. But the heater worked overtime, humming steadily and keeping the space cozy. Still, the owner knew it wouldn't be enough if the power went out. This part of town wasn't exactly known for reliable electricity during storms. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Midnight had come and gone, and exhaustion was starting to show on everyone's faces. Eyes were heavy, shoulders slumped, and voices grew softer. People began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, trying to find positions that might feel more restful. That's when it hit him. These guys couldn't stay awake all night waiting for the storm to pass. They needed somewhere to lie down, even if it wasn't perfect. He walked over to the group and cleared his throat softly. "Listen," he said, drawing their attention. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. No point in trying to drive anywhere tonight, not in this weather. You can crash here if you want. It ain't 5-star accommodations, but it'll do." For a moment, no one said anything. Then the younger man broke the silence. "You serious? You'd let us sleep here?" "Of course," the owner replied with a shrug. "Where else are you gonna go? Besides, it's freezing out there and you look like you could use the rest." The gratitude in the room was palpable. One by one, the men thanked him, their voices filled with relief. Some joked about how they'd never expected to spend the night in a diner, while others simply smiled and nodded, too tired to put their feelings into words. The owner got to work rearranging the space. He pulled extra blankets from the storeroom and spread them out on the booths and chairs. He turned off most of the lights, leaving only a dim glow from a single lamp near the counter. The effect was calming, almost homey. As the truckers settled in, finding spots to stretch out and get comfortable, the owner busied himself with small tasks. He checked the coffee maker one last time, added wood to the tiny fireplace in the corner, and double-checked the locks on the doors. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the atmosphere shifted. The tension melted away, replaced by a quiet sense of safety. Before heading to bed himself, he planned to grab a few hours of sleep on the couch in the back. He paused to take it all in. 10 men, complete strangers, had walked into his diner seeking refuge. Now they were lying down, trusting him to keep them safe through the night. It was a strange feeling, knowing he played such a crucial role in their lives, even if only for a short time. As he lay down on the couch, pulling a thin blanket over himself, he thought about how unpredictable life could be. Just hours ago, he'd been closing up shop, ready to call it a night. Now he was sharing his space and his heart with people who needed him. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, and the wind screamed louder than ever. But inside the diner, the world felt calm. The storm outside was powerful, yes, but the bond forming inside was stronger. And as sleep finally claimed him, the owner couldn't help but smile. The night stretched on, long and quiet, broken only by the howling wind outside and the occasional creak of the diner's wooden floorboards. Inside, the warmth of the small space wrapped around everyone like a comforting hug. The owner had done everything he could to make sure the truckers were comfortable. Blankets were spread across booths, chairs were pushed together to create makeshift beds, and the faint glow of the fireplace flickered in the corner, casting soft shadows on the walls. But even with all these efforts, it wasn't just the physical comfort that made the difference. It was the way he moved among them, checking in without being intrusive, offering another cup of coffee or an extra blanket before anyone had to ask. He didn't say much, but his presence alone was reassuring. There was something about the calmness in his eyes, the steadiness in his movements that told the truckers they were safe here. One of the men, older than the rest with deep lines etched into his face from years spent on the road, sat propped up in a booth near the window. He stared out at the storm, watching the snow pile higher and higher against the glass. After a while, he turned to the owner, who was tidying up behind the counter. "You know," the man said, his voice low but steady, "you didn't have to do this. Most folks would have sent us packing once they saw how many of us there were." The owner stopped what he was doing and looked over at him. For a moment he didn't respond, as if he was thinking carefully about his words. Then he shrugged and gave a small smile. "Maybe," he said simply, "but I figure if the tables were turned, if I was out there freezing my tail off, I'd hope someone would do the same for me." The older man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Still, not everybody thinks like that. Some people see trouble coming and shut their doors tight. You opened yours wide." There was a pause, and then one of the younger truckers chimed in from across the room. "Yeah, and we're grateful for it. Seriously, man, you've got no idea how much this means to us." The owner waved a hand dismissively, brushing off the praise. "It's nothing special, just doing what needs to be done." But the truth was, it was special. In a world where people often kept to themselves, where kindness sometimes felt like a rare commodity, what he was doing stood out. These men weren't family, friends, or even regular customers. They were strangers. Yet here he was, sharing his space, his resources, and his time, without expecting anything in return. As the night wore on, conversations began to flow more freely. At first, they were light. Talk about the weather, the roads, the quirks of life on the highway. But as the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up, the topics grew deeper. Stories started spilling out unprompted, like water breaking through a dam. One man talked about his kids back home, how he missed them more than anything but knew the money he earned kept food on their table. Another shared a story about losing a close friend to a bad accident on the road, his voice thick with emotion as he described the guilt of not being able to save him. A third spoke about the loneliness of the job, the endless miles of solitude interrupted only by brief stops at places like this diner. The owner listened intently, nodding along and occasionally chiming in with a comment or question. He didn't try to fix anything or offer advice, he just let them talk, and somehow that simple act, giving them space to share their burdens, felt like a gift in itself. At one point, the younger man who'd been frustrated earlier leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You ever think about quitting?" he asked suddenly, looking around at the others. "I mean, this life, it's hard. Long hours, crappy pay, missing birthdays and holidays. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." The older man chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Every damn day," he admitted. "But then I remind myself why I started in the first place. Freedom, mostly. Out here nobody tells you what to do. You set your own pace, take care of business your way. Sure, it's tough, but it's honest. Work. And when you get right down to it, there's something kinda beautiful about seeing the whole country roll by your windshield." The younger man nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Guess I never thought about it like that." "Nah. You're too busy worrying about the next load or the next breakdown," the older man teased gently. "When you've been out here as long as I have, you start noticing the little things, the sunrises, the open skies, the random acts of kindness from people like—" He gestured toward the owner, who was pretending not to listen. "Well, like our host here." The comment drew a round of agreement from the others, and the owner couldn't help but chuckle. All right, he said, holding up his hands. "Let's not get carried away. I'm just trying to keep the coffee hot and the lights on." But the mood in the room had shifted. What had started as a group of weary, stressed-out travelers had transformed into something else entirely. A collection of individuals bound together by shared experiences, mutual respect, and a newfound sense of camaraderie. By the time the IP clock ticked closer to dawn, most of the men had drifted off to sleep. Some snored softly, curled up under blankets, while others lay awake, staring at the ceiling or watching the fire crackle in the corner. The owner stayed up longer than he intended, partly because he wanted to make sure everyone was settled and partly because he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was different. He thought about the stories he'd heard, the lives he'd touched, however briefly. These men weren't just faces passing through his diner anymore. They were real people with dreams, struggles, and hearts full of hope. And in opening his doors to them, he realized he'd gained something too. A reminder of the power of connection, of the way a single act of kindness could ripple outward and touch lives in ways you might never expect. Outside, the storm still raged, relentless and unforgiving. But inside the diner, a different kind of storm had passed, one of doubt, fear, and isolation. In its place was a quiet calm, a sense of belonging that lingered long after the last ember in the fireplace faded to ash. As the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the blinds, the diner began to stir. The storm outside had finally eased, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white snow. The wind no longer howled like it had during the night. Instead, an eerie stillness settled over the landscape. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, as if the earth itself was catching its breath after hours of chaos. Inside, the owner woke up stiffly from his makeshift bed on the couch. He stretched and rubbed his eyes, glancing around at the men sprawled out across the diner. Some were still asleep, their breathing slow and steady, while others stirred groggily, blinking against the dim morning light filtering in. One by one, they began to wake, sitting up and stretching with groans and yawns. The younger man who'd been frustrated about his delayed route was the first to fully rise. He shuffled toward the counter, scratching his head and squinting at the clock. "What time is it?" he mumbled, his voice rough from sleep. "Just after sunrise," the owner replied, already moving to start a fresh pot of coffee. "Figured you'd all want some caffeine after last night." The younger man chuckled softly. "Man, I don't even remember the last time I slept in a diner. Feels weird, but kinda nice, you know?" The owner smiled faintly as he poured water into the machine. "Glad you found it comfortable enough." As the aroma of brewing coffee filled the air, the other truckers started waking up too. They gathered around the counter, pulling chairs, close and leaning on the edge of their seats. No one seemed eager to rush out. Not yet. Something about the calm of the morning kept them rooted in place, reluctant to break the spell of the night before. One of the older men, the one who'd talked about freedom on the road, cleared his throat and looked around at the group. "You know, I've been thinking about what we said last night, about how hard this job can be. And yeah, it's tough, sure, but moments like this, they remind me why I keep going." He gestured toward the owner, who was busy slicing bread for toast. "This right here, this is what makes it worth it. People, like him. Strangers turning into friends, sharing stories, helping each other out when things get rough. That's what keeps me coming back to the road, even when it feels like it's breaking me down." The words hung in the air for a moment, sinking in. Another man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. Last night wasn't just about getting out of the storm, it was bigger than that. Like for a little while we weren't just a bunch of guys stuck in bad weather. We were a team, a family almost." The owner paused mid-slice, glancing up at them. His cheeks flushed slightly, not used to being the center of attention or hearing such heartfelt words directed at him. "I didn't do much," he said quietly. "Just opened the door and made some coffee." But the men weren't having it. "Are you kidding?" one of them interjected, shaking his head. "You gave us more than coffee. You gave us a place to rest, to talk, to feel human again. When you're out here driving day after day, it's easy to forget what that feels like. But last night, you reminded us." The sincerity in his voice silenced any protests the owner might have made. Instead, he simply nodded, focusing on finishing breakfast. Toast popped up in the toaster, golden, brown and warm. He buttered the slices carefully, adding jam for those who wanted it, and set plates on the counter alongside steaming mugs of coffee. For the next hour, the diner buzzed with quiet conversation. The mood was lighter now, less weighed down by the worries of the previous night. Laughter bubbled up occasionally, sparked by jokes about snoring or someone accidentally kicking over a chair in their sleep. Even the younger man who'd been so anxious about falling behind schedule seemed more at ease. "You know," he said between bites of toast, "my boss is gonna kill me when I tell him I got stuck in a blizzard. But honestly, I don't care. Not after this. If I hadn't stopped here, I wouldn't have met you guys, wouldn't have realized how much we all have in common." The older man grinned, raising his coffee mug in a mock toast. "To blizzards, then. May they always lead us to places like this." Everyone laughed, clinking their mugs together in agreement. As they ate, the owner couldn't help but watch them, marveling at how quickly walls had come down. These men had walked into his diner as strangers, wary and tired, but now they joked and teased each other like old friends. Bonds had formed overnight, forged in the crucible of shared struggle and unexpected kindness. When the meal was finished, the men began gathering their belongings, preparing to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The roads would still be icy, the drive slow and treacherous, but none of them seemed as worried as they had been the night before. Before leaving, the older man stepped up to the counter, pulling out his wallet. "How much do we owe you for everything?" he asked. The owner waved him off immediately. "Nothing. Consider it on the house." The man frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "No way. You fed us, gave us shelter, let us crash here. We can't just walk out without paying." "It's fine," the owner insisted, his tone firm but kind. "Really, just promise me one thing." "What's that?" the man asked, raising an eyebrow. "Next time you see someone in need, whether it's a stranded driver, a kid walking home in the rain, or anyone else, pay it forward. That's all the thanks I need." The man stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Deal," he said, extending his hand. "And thank you. For everything." One by one, the others followed suit, shaking hands and offering heartfelt goodbyes. Some promised to stop by again if they ever passed through town. Others vowed to spread the word about the little diner that felt more like home than any hotel ever could. As the last truck pulled out of the parking lot, the owner stood in the doorway, watching them go. The sun was higher now, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered fields. The world looked peaceful, almost magical. He sighed deeply, feeling a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. Last night had been unplanned, unpredictable, and far from easy, but it had also been unforgettable. Turning back inside, he glanced around the diner. Blankets were folded neatly on the booths, chairs pushed back into place. Everything looked almost exactly as it had before the storm hit. Almost, because something had changed. Something intangible, invisible, but undeniable. And as he began cleaning up, humming softly to himself, he realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness leave the biggest impact, not just on others but on yourself too. The diner was quiet again, the kind of silence that felt both peaceful and heavy after the whirlwind of the night before. The owner stood by the window, wiping down the glass with a damp cloth. Outside, the world sparkled under the morning sun, the snow glistening like a sea of diamonds stretching across the fields and roads. It was beautiful, but it carried an edge of harshness too, the kind of beauty that reminded you how unforgiving nature could be. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was still early, barely past 8 in the morning, but it felt like days had passed since he'd flipped the closed sign over last night. His body ached from sleeping on the couch, his mind buzzed with fragments of conversations, laughter, and gratitude. And yet, there was a strange lightness in his chest. He couldn't quite put it into words, but something about the last 12 hours had shifted something inside him. As he finished cleaning the windows, he heard the distant rumble of engines. At first he thought it might just be the wind or some lingering echo of the storm, but then he saw them, 10 trucks pulling out onto the highway one by one. They moved slowly, cautiously, their tires crunching through the thick layer of snow. Each driver honked their horn as they passed, a cheerful salute to the man who'd given them shelter when they needed it most. The sound of those horns made him smile. He stepped outside, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket to ward off the cold, and watched as the line of rigs disappeared into the distance. The sight of them rolling away filled him with a mix of emotions: pride, relief, and maybe even a touch of sadness. For all the years he'd run this diner, he'd never experienced anything quite like what had happened last night. Back inside, he started tidying up. There wasn't much to do. The men had been considerate, folding blankets and stacking chairs before they left, but he wanted everything to feel normal again. Normalcy was comforting, especially after a night that had been anything but ordinary. As he worked, his thoughts drifted back to the conversations they'd shared. He remembered the younger guy talking about missing his kids, the older man recounting the loss of a friend, and the way everyone seemed to open up once they realized they weren't alone. Those stories stuck with him, not because they were dramatic or unusual, but because they were real. They reminded him of something important. No matter how different people seemed on the surface, everyone carried burdens, hopes, and fears. By mid-morning, the diner was spotless. Everything was back in its place. The coffee pot gleamed, the counters were wiped clean, and the chairs sat neatly tucked under the tables. But instead of feeling satisfied, the owner found himself pacing restlessly. Something was nagging at him, though he couldn't quite figure out what. Then it hit him. It wasn't over. Not really. He walked over to the counter and pulled out a notebook he kept for jotting down orders and inventory lists. Flipping to a blank page, he grabbed a pen and began writing. At first, it was just random thoughts, scribbles that didn't make much sense. But soon the words started flowing more clearly. "Kindness isn't loud," he wrote. "It doesn't demand attention or applause. Sometimes it's as simple as opening a door, sharing a meal, or listening when someone needs to talk. And sometimes it changes lives, not just theirs, but yours too." He stopped writing and stared at the page for a moment, letting the words sink in. This wasn't something he planned to share with anyone. It was just for him, a reminder of what had happened here and why it mattered. Just as he closed the notebook, the phone rang. Startled, he hurried to answer it. "Hello? "Hey, is this the diner near Route 12?" a gruff voice asked on the other end. "Yes, it is," the owner replied, leaning against the counter. "This is Charlie from the truck stop down the road. I heard you took in a bunch of stranded drivers last night during the storm. Is that true?" The owner hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yeah, I guess so. 10 of them. They needed a place to stay, so I let them crash here." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low whistle. "Wow, that's impressive. Look, word's spreading fast around here. A lot of folks are talking about what you did. Thought you should know." "Thanks," the owner said, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "But honestly, it wasn't a big deal. Anyone would have done the same." Charlie chuckled. "Maybe, maybe not. Either way, you've got people talking, and not just locals. Truckers talk. To each other, you know? Word travels far when someone does something good." After hanging up, the owner set the phone down and sighed. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to run his diner and help out where he could. But deep down, he understood what Charlie meant. Stories like this had a way of spreading, especially among communities like truckers, who relied on trust and connection to get through long, lonely days on the road. Later that afternoon, a couple of local regulars stopped by for lunch. They were farmers, brothers who came in every few days to grab a bite and chat about crops, weather, and whatever else was on their minds. Today, though, their conversation took a different turn. "Heard about what happened last night," one of them said, nodding approvingly. "Pretty brave of you letting all those guys stay here." The owner shrugged. "Wasn't brave, just practical. Couldn't send them back out into that mess." "Still," the other brother chimed in, "not everyone would have done it. Most folks would have worried about the hassle or the cost. You went above and beyond." The compliment made him uncomfortable, but he forced a smile. "Like I said, it's not a big deal, just doing what needed to be done." But as the day wore on, it became clear that the story wasn't staying confined to the diner. More customers trickled in than usual, many of them mentioning the blizzard and the stranded truckers. Some thanked him directly. Others simply ordered their meals and left generous tips. By evening, the tip jar was overflowing, and the owner found himself overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers returning the favor. That night, as he locked up the diner and turned off the lights, he paused to look out the window one last time. The snow was beginning to melt in patches, revealing glimpses of the asphalt beneath. The roads would clear eventually, life would return to normal, and the memory of the storm would fade, for most people anyway. But for him, it wouldn't. Last night had reminded him of something he'd always known but sometimes forgot. That the smallest acts of kindness can ripple outward in ways you'll never fully understand. As he headed home, the weight of the day finally catching up with him, he felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over him. Life was unpredictable, full of storms, both literal and metaphorical. But if he could offer even a little warmth and shelter to those caught in the chaos, then maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next morning, the diner opened as usual. The owner unlocked the door, flipped the closed sign to open, and stepped back inside. He didn't expect much, just another quiet day serving locals and maybe a few travelers passing through. But within minutes, something unusual happened. A big rig pulled into the parking lot, then another, and another. At first, he thought it was coincidence. Maybe they were stopping for breakfast or fuel before hitting the road again. But as more trucks arrived, filling every available space and lining up along the shoulder of the highway, it became clear this wasn't just a random stop. These drivers weren't here for coffee or pancakes, they were here for him. One by one, the truckers climbed out of their cabs, boots crunching in the melting snow. Some carried thermoses, others had hats pulled low against the crisp morning air, but all of them wore smiles. They walked toward the diner, greeting the owner with waves and nods as they approached. "Morning," one of them called out cheerfully. "Mind if we grab a seat?" The owner stood in the doorway, stunned. Sure, of course. Come on in." Within moments, the small diner was packed. Men filled every booth, chair, and corner of counter space. The hum of conversation filled the room, louder and livelier than it had been in years. Orders flew fast and furious. Bacon and eggs, Stacks of pancakes, cups of black coffee, extra toast. But it wasn't just the food they wanted. As the owner moved between tables, pouring coffee and delivering plates, he noticed something different about these customers. They weren't just eating, they were thanking him. "This place is amazing," one man said, raising his mug in salute. "Heard what you did last night. Took care of those guys during the storm. Just wanted to say thanks for setting an example." Another chimed in, nodding enthusiastically. "Yeah, man. We don't always get treated well out here. People see us as troublemakers or nuisances, but you reminded us that there are still good people left in the world." The owner laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "I didn't do anything special, just gave him a place to stay." "That's exactly the point," another driver interjected. "It wasn't special to you, but it meant everything to them. And now it means something to us too." As the morning stretched on, the line of trucks outside grew longer. Drivers who couldn't fit inside the diner waited patiently, chatting with each other and sharing stories. Some even brought gifts: a jar of homemade jam from one, a bag of fresh apples from another. Word spread quickly. Local radio stations picked up the story, mentioning the little diner that had become a symbol of kindness. Social media posts popped up, tagging the diner and sharing photos of the long line of rigs stretching down the road. By noon, reporters showed up, cameras in hand, eager to capture the heartwarming scene. The owner tried to stay focused on his work, but it was hard not to feel overwhelmed. Every time he turned around, someone new was shaking his hand or patting him on the back. One reporter asked if he'd like to share his thoughts on camera. "I'm not looking for attention," he said firmly but kindly. "All I did was open my doors when people needed help. That's it." His humility only endeared him further to the crowd. Truckers cheered when he spoke, clapping as if he'd just delivered the most inspiring speech they'd ever heard. By late afternoon, the diner was running low on supplies. The breadbasket was nearly empty. The coffee pots had been refilled countless times, and the grill was starting to cool down from overuse. Still, no one complained. If anything, the scarcity added to the charm. It made the experience feel authentic, unpolished and real. One older trucker sat at the counter sipping his third cup of coffee. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the formica surface. "You know," he said, his voice soft but steady, "a lot of folks talk about community, about helping each other out. But you actually lived it. You didn't just say the right things, you did them." The owner paused, holding a plate of scrambled eggs midair. "I didn't think about it like that," he admitted. "I just reacted. Felt like the right thing to do. And that's why it matters." The trucker replied. "Most people think too much, worry about what others will say or how it'll look. You didn't hesitate. You saw a need and filled it. That's rare these days." The comment stayed with the owner long after the trucker finished his meal and headed back to his rig. It wasn't just flattery, it was truth. In a world where fear often outweighed compassion, he had chosen to act without hesitation, and somehow that choice had resonated far beyond the walls of his tiny diner. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the snowy landscape, the parade of trucks finally began to thin. Drivers shook hands, hugged, and promised to return someday. Many left notes scribbled on napkins or receipts. "Thanks for reminding us what kindness looks like. We won't forget this. Keep doing what you're doing. It matters." When the last truck rumbled away, the parking lot looked emptier than it had in hours. The owner stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. His feet hurt, his arms ached, and his voice was hoarse from answering questions and taking orders all day. But despite the exhaustion, he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. Inside, the diner was a mess. Plates piled high in the sink, crumbs scattered across the floor, chairs askew from constant use. Normally the sight would have stressed him out, but tonight it felt like proof of something bigger. Proof that connection mattered, that kindness could ripple outward and touch lives in ways he'd never imagined. He started cleaning up slowly, piece by piece, letting the quiet settle over the space. Outside, the stars began to peek through the darkening sky, twinkling faintly like distant lanterns. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to sit down. He pulled out the notebook from earlier that week, the one where he'd written about kindness and flipped to a blank page. Picking up his pen, he wrote 2 simple words: "Thank you." Not because he owed anyone gratitude, but because he realized how much he'd gained from giving. Tomorrow, life would go back to normal, or as normal as it could be after a day like this. The diner would reopen, customers would come and go, and the grind of daily routine would resume. But for now, he let himself linger in the moment. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest memories. And today, he'd been reminded that even in the busiest, hardest times, humanity has a way of shining through. The next morning, the diner opened its doors a little earlier than usual. The owner had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the past 2 days like a movie stuck on repeat. He'd woken up before sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen again. And sure enough, as he flipped the closed sign to open, he saw headlights in the distance. This time, it wasn't just a handful of trucks. It was dozens, maybe even hundreds. They came from every direction: big rigs, flatbeds, refrigerated haulers, and everything in between. Some were shiny and new, while others looked like they'd been patched together with duct tape and determination. One by one, they lined up along the highway, their engines rumbling softly in the early morning chill. The owner stepped outside, squinting against the bright sunlight reflecting off the melting snow. He walked toward the first truck in line, unsure what to say. Before he could speak, the driver hopped down from his cab, grinning ear to ear. "Hey there," the man said, extending a hand. "Just wanted to stop by and thank you for what you did. Word's gotten around and we figured it was time to show our appreciation." Appreciation? The owner frowned slightly, confused. What exactly were they thanking him for? All he'd done was offer shelter during a storm. A simple act of kindness that felt natural at the time. But as more drivers climbed out of their cabs and approached him, the gratitude became impossible to ignore. "We heard how you took care of those guys," another driver explained. "How you didn't hesitate to help when no one else would have blamed you for turning them away. That kind of thing doesn't happen often enough these days." A third man chimed in, holding up a gear thermos. "I brought some coffee. Figured you might need it after yesterday." The owner laughed nervously, scratching the back of his neck. "Thanks, but I think I've got plenty of coffee left over from all the pots I brewed yesterday." That comment drew laughter from the group, breaking the tension. Slowly, the parking lot transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Drivers gathered around, swapping stories, sharing snacks, and chatting with anyone who'd listen. Some brought gifts, homemade cookies, fresh fruit, or small trinkets they'd picked up during their travels. Others simply sat quietly, soaking in the atmosphere of camaraderie and goodwill. Inside the diner, the scene was equally chaotic but undeniably heartwarming. Every table was occupied, every booth filled to capacity. Men laughed and joked, their voices overlapping in a symphony of conversation. Orders poured in faster than the owner could keep up with, but he didn't mind. For the first time in years, the diner felt alive, not just as a place to grab a meal, but as a meeting point, a sanctuary, a reminder of what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself. One older trucker leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach contentedly. "Man, this food hits different today," he said, glancing around the crowded room. "Maybe it's because we're all here together. Feels like family." His words struck a chord with everyone within earshot. Heads nodded in agreement, and someone raised a mug of coffee in a silent toast. The owner caught the gesture from across the room and smiled faintly, though his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not like this. Still, he couldn't deny the impact of what had happened. Over the course of 2 days, his tiny diner had become a symbol of hope and unity. People from all walks of life, truckers, locals, reporters, even curious tourists, had shown up to witness the aftermath of an act of kindness that had spread far beyond the confines of the building. As the hours passed, the crowd only grew larger. More trucks arrived, their drivers eager to pay tribute to the man who had inspired so many. Some stayed for meals, others simply stopped by to shake his hand and express their gratitude. One young woman approached the counter, her eyes shining with emotion. She wasn't a trucker. She looked like she might be a college student, but she carried herself with purpose. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly, placing a folded piece of paper on the counter. "You probably don't know me, but your story changed my day. Changed my week, honestly. I've been having a tough time lately, and hearing about what you did reminded me that there's still good in the world." The owner blinked, taken aback by her sincerity. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything," she replied with a smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing. It matters more than you realize." By late afternoon, the diner was running dangerously low on supplies. The bread was almost gone, the coffee grounds were nearly depleted, and the grill had been fired up so many times it was starting to protest. But none of that mattered. The energy in the room was electric, fueled by laughter, shared meals, and countless acts of generosity. Outside, the line of trucks stretched farther than the eye could see. Drivers honked their horns playfully, creating an impromptu symphony that echoed through the valley. Someone started playing music over a portable speaker, and soon people were dancing in the parking lot, their boots kicking up clumps of melting snow. It was chaos, but the kind of chaos that made you believe in humanity again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the crowd began to thin. Drivers hugged each other goodbye, promising to stay in touch via CB radio or social media. Many left notes behind, scribbled messages on receipts, napkins, or scraps of paper. "Thank you for reminding us what kindness looks like. You've restored my faith in people. We'll never forget this place or you." The owner read each note carefully, tucking them safely into a shoebox under the counter. They weren't just pieces of paper. They were reminders of the power of connection, of the way a single act of kindness could ripple outward and touch lives in ways he'd never imagined. When the last truck finally pulled away, the parking lot fell silent. The owner stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear into the darkness. His body ached from the long day, his mind buzzed with exhaustion, but his heart felt full. For a moment, he let himself linger there, breathing in the cool night air. Then slowly he turned and went back inside. Tomorrow life would return to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after a day like this. The diner would reopen, customers would come and go, and the grind of daily routine would resume. But for now, he allowed himself to sit down, if only for a few minutes. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest memories. And today he'd been reminded that even in the busiest, hardest times, humanity has a way of shining through.